Harmony Creek was a town like a warm hug. Nestled between rolling green hills and a sparkling blue river, it felt like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. At the heart of Harmony Creek stood the little white church, its steeple reaching towards the sky like a hopeful finger. It wasn't a fancy church, not like the big ones in the city. It was small, with simple wooden pews and stained glass windows that told stories of kindness and faith. The church wasn't just a building, it was the heart of Harmony Creek. Every Sunday, families gathered, dressed in their best clothes, to sing hymns and listen to Pastor Emily's gentle sermons. Children squirmed in their seats, trying to stay quiet, while the older folks nodded along to the familiar words. The church was where people celebrated weddings, christened new babies, and said goodbye to loved ones who had passed away. It was also where the town came together for potlucks, bake sales, and holiday celebrations. The annual Christmas pageant was a huge event, with every child in town eager to play a role. Mrs. Gable, the kindly old woman who lived next door to the church, always made the best cookies for the after-service gatherings. Mr. Henderson, the town's carpenter, kept the church in good repair, fixing leaky roofs and creaky doors with his own 2 hands. The church wasn't just for Sundays either. During the week, it hosted a soup kitchen for the needy, a book club for the adults, and a tutoring program for the kids. It was a place where everyone felt welcome, no matter their background or beliefs. It was a safe haven, a place of comfort and support. The church was where the town celebrated victories and mourned losses. When young Timmy broke his leg playing baseball, the whole town showed up at the church with cards and flowers for his family. When old Mrs. Peterson lost her husband, the church was filled with people offering their condolences and helping her through her grief. The church represented everything good about Harmony Creek, its sense of community, its kindness, and its unwavering faith. It was more than just bricks and mortar, it was the soul of the town. Everyone felt connected to it, like a member of a big, loving family. The church bells rang every Sunday, calling people to worship, but they also rang out to celebrate every birth, every graduation, every happy occasion in Harmony Creek. The sound of those bells was the sound of home. The church was old, but it was strong. It had stood for over 100 years, weathering storms and welcoming generations of Harmony Creek residents. Nobody could imagine Harmony Creek without it. It was a constant, a symbol of hope and togetherness. It was, quite simply, everything. Then, one starless night, the unthinkable happened. A crackling sound, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot, echoed through the silent streets of Harmony Creek. It grew louder, faster, turning into a roaring monster that devoured the peace and quiet. Orange flames, hungry and wild, licked at the sides of the little white church, dancing in the darkness like evil spirits. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the old wood and dry shingles. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and black, blotting out the stars. The church bells, which had always rung with joy, now clanged in alarm, a desperate cry for help. People poured out of their homes, drawn by the noise and the smell of smoke. They stood in their pajamas, their faces pale and shocked, watching in disbelief as their beloved church was consumed by flames. Little Sarah, who had played an angel in the Christmas pageant just months before, clung to her mother's leg, her eyes wide with fear. Old Mr. Henderson, the carpenter, stood with his head in his hands, tears streaming down his face. He had spent so many years caring for that church, and now he could only watch it burn. Pastor Emily arrived, her face etched with sorrow. She tried to comfort the townspeople, but her own voice trembled with emotion. "We have to have faith," she said, her voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. "We will rebuild." But even as she spoke, the flames climbed higher, engulfing the steeple and sending sparks flying into the night sky. The fire trucks arrived, their sirens screaming, but it was too late. The fire had already taken hold, and the firefighters could only try to contain it, to prevent it from spreading to the surrounding buildings. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as the roof of the church collapsed, sending a shower of sparks and debris into the air. The stained glass windows shattered, their beautiful images of saints and angels reduced to glittering fragments. As the night wore on, the fire slowly began to die down, leaving behind a smoldering ruin. The little white church, the heart of Harmony Creek, was gone. In its place was a pile of ashes and charred wood, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had befallen their town. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the sound of weeping. The townspeople stood in the cold morning light, staring at the ruins of their church. A sense of disbelief hung in the air. How could this have happened? Who would do such a thing? The sadness was overwhelming, a heavy weight on everyone's hearts. Harmony Creek had lost more than just a building, it had lost a part of itself. The future felt uncertain, the sense of community shaken. But even in the midst of their grief, a flicker of hope remained. They would rebuild. They had to. The spirit of Harmony Creek, like a tiny ember, still glowed within the ashes. The morning after the fire, the quiet of Harmony Creek was broken by the arrival of official vehicles. A team of investigators, led by Detective Sarah Miller, arrived to determine the cause of the blaze. Detective Miller was known throughout the state as a smart and careful investigator. She had a sharp mind and an even sharper eye for detail. She wasn't easily fooled, and she always followed the evidence, no matter where it led. Detective Miller stepped out of her car, her gaze immediately drawn to the charred remains of the church. She took a deep breath, the smell of smoke still heavy in the air. This wasn't just a building that had burned, it was a piece of history, a symbol of hope, gone up in flames. She knew that the people of Harmony Creek were counting on her to find out what had happened and to bring whoever was responsible to justice. She had short, brown hair, pulled back into a practical ponytail. Her eyes, the color of warm chocolate, were intelligent and observant, constantly scanning her surroundings. She wore a simple, dark suit, and her movements were efficient and purposeful. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that inspired trust. Detective Miller spoke briefly with the fire chief, gathering information about the fire's timeline and the initial assessment of the scene. Then, she gathered her team and began the painstaking process of examining the ruins. She instructed them to be thorough, to document everything, and to overlook nothing. This wasn't just an accident, she said to her team, her voice firm but calm. I want every inch of this site searched. I want to know what happened here. Detective Miller understood that the investigation would be difficult. The fire had destroyed much of the evidence, and the sheer volume of debris would make the search challenging. But she was determined to find answers. She knew that the people of Harmony Creek deserved to know the truth. She walked slowly through the ashes, her eyes scanning the ground. She carefully picked up a piece of charred wood, examining it closely. She noticed the way the wood had burned, the patterns of the flames. She made a note in her small, leather-bound notebook. Every detail, no matter how small, could be important. Detective Miller knew that this case would test her skills and her patience. But she was ready. She had a reputation to uphold, and more importantly, she had a promise to keep to the people of Harmony Creek. She would find out what happened to their church. The investigation had begun, and Detective Miller would not rest until she found the truth. She felt the weight of the town's sorrow, but also the strength of their spirit, and she knew they would get through this, together. The search for clues was slow and painstaking. The investigators moved carefully through the debris, sifting through ashes and charred wood, their eyes constantly scanning for anything out of the ordinary. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, a grim and dirty task. Each scoop of ash was carefully examined, each piece of debris catalogued and photographed. Detective Miller oversaw the operation, ensuring that every possible lead was followed. She knew that even the smallest detail could be crucial to solving the case. The team used special tools to sift through the ashes, separating metal from wood, glass from stone. They were looking for anything that might have started the fire, anything that might point to a cause. Hours turned into days, and the investigators continued their work, their faces smudged with soot, their bodies aching from the physical labor. The mood was somber, a constant reminder of the loss the town had suffered. Just when they were starting to feel discouraged, one of the investigators, a young officer named Davis, called out. "Detective Miller, I think I've found something." Detective Miller rushed over to where Davis was standing. He was carefully holding a small, plastic bag. Inside the bag was a melted, blackened object. It was difficult to tell what it was at first glance, but as Detective Miller examined it closer, she realized what it was: a cigarette. The cigarette was badly damaged, almost unrecognizable. It was fused with melted plastic, likely from a lighter or some other container. It was clear that it had been subjected to intense heat. Detective Miller carefully took the bag from Davis, her eyes narrowing. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "Near the back of the church, by the old storage shed," Davis replied. "It was buried pretty deep in the ashes." Detective Miller knew that this could be a significant find. Cigarettes were a common cause of accidental fires, but the fact that it was found near the back of the church, away from the main area, raised suspicion. She carefully sealed the bag, making sure not to disturb the contents. "Get this to the lab," she said to Davis. "I want them to analyze it. I want to know everything they can find out about it. What kind of cigarette it was, if there's any DNA on it, anything." Davis nodded and hurried off to deliver the evidence. Detective Miller stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where the cigarette had been found. A cigarette could be just an accident, but it could also be something more. She hoped that the lab analysis would provide some answers, some clues that would lead her closer to the truth. The melted cigarette, a small, insignificant object, had suddenly become a symbol of hope in the search for justice. Days later, the phone rang in Detective Miller's office. It was the lab. Her heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting anxiously for this call. "Detective Miller," she answered, her voice steady despite the anticipation she felt. "Detective, we've got some results on that cigarette you sent over," the voice on the other end said. "It's pretty damaged, but we were able to extract some partial DNA." Detective Miller leaned forward in her chair, her grip tightening on the phone. "Partial DNA? Is it enough to get a match?" "It's not a complete profile, but it's enough to run against the local database," the lab technician replied. "There's a good chance we can get a hit." A surge of excitement coursed through Detective Miller. A potential lead. After days of sifting through ashes and facing dead ends, this was the break they needed. "Run it," she said, her voice urgent. "Run it now. Call me back as soon as you have something." She hung up the phone and paced her office, her mind racing. The partial DNA could be a game changer. It could lead them to the person who started the fire, the person who had destroyed the church. It could bring justice to the people of Harmony Creek. The wait felt like an eternity. Detective Miller tried to focus on other tasks, but her thoughts kept returning to the DNA analysis. She imagined the lab technicians working diligently, comparing the partial profile against the database, searching for a match. Finally, the phone rang again. Detective Miller snatched it up. "Miller," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Detective, we've got a match," the lab technician said, his voice filled with excitement. "It's not a perfect match, but it's close enough to warrant further investigation. The DNA belongs to a Robert Jenkins." Robert Jenkins. The name was familiar, but Detective Miller couldn't quite place it. "Robert Jenkins," she repeated. "Do you have any information on him? Address, occupation, anything?" The lab technician rattled off the details. Robert Jenkins, a local contractor. He lived just outside of town. He had a history of minor disputes with the church. Detective Miller's eyes widened. A contractor with a history of disputes with the church. This was more than just a random match. This was a potential suspect. "Thank you," she said to the lab technician. "You've given us something to work with." She hung up the phone, a sense of purpose filling her. The partial DNA had given them a name, a face to put with the crime. It was a long shot, but it was a lead, and Detective Miller was determined to follow it to the end. The excitement of a potential break in the case fueled her determination. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready to face it. The people of Harmony Creek deserved justice, and Detective Miller was going to make sure they got it. The name Robert Jenkins hung in the air, heavy with implications. Detective Miller pulled up Robert Jenkins' file on her computer. The screen displayed a photo of a man in his late 40s, with a stern face and a receding hairline. He looked like someone who worked hard, but also someone who held a grudge. The file detailed Jenkins' contracting business, his address just outside of town, and, most importantly, his history of disputes with the church. It seemed that Jenkins had bid on several projects at the church over the years, including the renovation of the parish hall and the construction of a new playground. However, his bids had always been rejected, often in favor of other contractors who offered lower prices or better terms. According to the file, Jenkins had become increasingly frustrated with the church, accusing them of unfair practices and even suggesting that they were biased against him. He had reportedly made several angry phone calls to Pastor Emily and had even confronted some of the church elders in person, demanding an explanation for why his bids were always rejected. Detective Miller leaned back in her chair, considering the information. The DNA match, combined with Jenkins' history of disputes with the church, painted a troubling picture. It was still just circumstantial evidence, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. She decided to pay Jenkins a visit. She wanted to see him in person, to observe his demeanor, and to get a sense of whether he was capable of such a heinous act. She called Davis and instructed him to meet her at Jenkins' address. As they drove to Jenkins' house, Detective Miller couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She knew that confronting Jenkins could be dangerous. He was a man who had a lot to lose, and he might be desperate to protect himself. But she also knew that she had a duty to the people of Harmony Creek to find the truth, no matter the cost. They arrived at Jenkins' house, a modest ranch-style home on the outskirts of town. The yard was overgrown, and the house looked like it needed some repairs. Detective Miller took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. She walked up to the front door and knocked. A moment later, the door opened, and Robert Jenkins stood before her. He looked even sterner in person than he did in his photo. His eyes were cold and suspicious, and he seemed to be sizing her up. "Mr. Jenkins," Detective Miller said, her voice calm and professional. "I'm Detective Sarah Miller with the State Police. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the fire at the Harmony Creek Church." Jenkins' face paled slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know anything about any fire," he said, his voice defensive. "I haven't been near that church in years." Detective Miller looked him directly in the eye. "We found a cigarette at the scene, Mr. Jenkins," she said. "And it has your DNA on it." Jenkins' eyes darted nervously around the yard. He knew he was in trouble. The DNA had connected him to the scene. He tried to remain calm, but a bead of sweat trickled down his forehead. Detective Miller had her man. Or, at least, a very strong suspect. It was time to see what he had to say. To understand Bob Jenkins, you had to know his past. Years ago, Bob was a respected and hard-working member of Harmony Creek. He took pride in his contracting business and always strived to do the best job possible. He had built several homes in the town and was known for his honesty and reliability. But things started to change when the church needed some repairs. Bob saw this as a great opportunity to give back to the community and to showcase his skills. He spent hours preparing a detailed bid for the renovation of the parish hall, confident that he would win the contract. However, when the church announced their decision, Bob was shocked and disappointed. His bid had been rejected in favor of another contractor from out of town. Bob was furious. He felt that he had been treated unfairly and that the church had not given him a fair chance. He went to Pastor Emily and demanded an explanation. He argued that his bid was competitive and that he was a local contractor who understood the needs of the community. But Pastor Emily explained that the other contractor had offered a lower price and that the church had a responsibility to be good stewards of their resources. Bob didn't accept her explanation. He believed that the church had been biased against him and that they had deliberately chosen someone else to do the job. He became increasingly bitter and resentful. Over the next few years, Bob continued to bid on projects at the church, but he was always rejected. He became convinced that the church was deliberately trying to ruin his business. He started to spread rumors about the church, accusing them of corruption and mismanagement. He also became increasingly isolated from the community. People started to avoid him because of his angry outbursts and his constant complaints about the church. Bob felt like he had been betrayed by the town he had always loved. One day, Bob had a particularly heated argument with Mr. Peterson, one of the church elders, over a new playground project. Bob had submitted a bid, but it was once again rejected. Bob accused Mr. Peterson of being dishonest and threatened to take legal action. Mr. Peterson tried to calm Bob down, but Bob was beyond reason. He stormed off, vowing to get revenge on the church for all the wrongs they had done to him. This resentment festered within him, growing stronger with each passing year. The fire, in some ways, was the culmination of years of bitterness and frustration. It was a way for Bob to finally strike back at the people he felt had wronged him. This history explained his animosity towards the church, but did it justify arson? That was the question Detective Miller needed to answer. The flashback showed how a respected member of the community had become consumed by resentment, potentially leading him down a dark path. Detective Miller led Bob Jenkins into his living room. It was sparsely furnished and somewhat cluttered, reflecting a life that had become disorganized and unhappy. She sat him down on an old, worn-out armchair and began her questioning. "Mr. Jenkins, let's talk about the night of the fire," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Where were you that night?" Bob shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He avoided eye contact and fidgeted with his hands. "I was at home," he mumbled. "I was watching TV. Can anyone confirm that?" Detective Miller pressed. "Did anyone see you?" Bob hesitated. "No," he said finally. "I was alone." Detective Miller raised an eyebrow. "So, you have no alibi for the night of the fire?" Bob squirmed. "I didn't need one," he insisted. "I didn't do anything wrong." "But your DNA was found on a cigarette at the scene, Mr. Jenkins," Detective Miller reminded him. "How do you explain that?" Bob's face flushed red. He stammered, trying to come up with an explanation. I don't know," he said. "Maybe I dropped a cigarette there a long time ago. I used to go to the church all the time." "A long time ago?" Detective Miller challenged. "The cigarette was found near the back of the church, Mr. Jenkins, by the storage shed. That's not a place where people usually hang out." Bob's alibi was weak and unconvincing. His nervous behavior and evasive answers were making him look increasingly guilty. Detective Miller continued to press him, asking him about his disputes with the church, his angry phone calls to Pastor Emily, and his threats to Mr. Peterson. Each question seemed to make Bob more agitated. He became defensive and argumentative, denying any involvement in the fire. He claimed that he had nothing against the church and that he would never do anything to harm it. But Detective Miller didn't believe him. She could see the anger and resentment simmering beneath the surface. She knew that Bob Jenkins was hiding something, and she was determined to find out what it was. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice low and serious. "I understand that you're upset about what happened with the church. But setting fire to their building is not the answer. It's a crime, and it's hurting a lot of people." Bob remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Detective Miller knew that she was getting to him. She could see the doubt and fear creeping into his eyes. She just needed to keep pressing him, to keep asking questions, until he finally broke down and told her the truth. His shaky voice, his inability to maintain eye contact, and his flimsy excuse all pointed to one thing: Bob Jenkins was deeply implicated in the church fire. The questioning continued, each question tightening the net around the increasingly desperate contractor. As Detective Miller continued her investigation, more evidence began to surface against Bob Jenkins. The initial DNA evidence, although compelling, was not enough to secure a conviction. She needed more solid proof linking him to the scene of the crime on the night of the fire. She instructed her team to canvass the neighborhood around the church, hoping to find someone who might have seen something suspicious that night. Most of the residents had been asleep or had only noticed the fire after it had already engulfed the church. But then, a breakthrough. A local woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived just a few houses down from the church, came forward with a crucial piece of information. She told Detective Miller that she had been unable to sleep that night and had been looking out her window when she saw a truck driving slowly past her house. It was late, maybe around 11 or 11:30, Mrs. Gable explained. I didn't pay much attention to it at first, but then I noticed that it was driving really slowly, like it was trying to be quiet. Detective Miller asked her to describe the truck. Mrs. Gable said it was an old, beat-up pickup truck, dark in color, with a dent in the front fender. She couldn't be sure, but she thought she recognized the truck as belonging to Bob Jenkins. I've seen that truck around town before, Mrs. Gable said. I think it's Bob Jenkins' truck. You know, the contractor who always argues with the church. Detective Miller's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly what she needed. A witness who could place Bob Jenkins' truck near the church on the night of the fire. She showed Mrs. Gable a picture of Bob's truck, and Mrs. Gable confirmed that it looked very similar to the truck she had seen. The evidence was mounting against Bob Jenkins. The DNA, his history of disputes with the church, his weak alibi, and now a witness who had seen his truck near the scene of the crime. It was becoming increasingly clear that Bob Jenkins was the prime suspect in the arson investigation. Detective Miller knew that she had enough evidence to arrest Bob Jenkins. But she wanted to be sure. She wanted to have an airtight case that would stand up in court. She instructed her team to gather even more evidence, to search Bob's truck and his house for any sign of accelerants or other materials that could have been used to start the fire. The net was closing in around Bob, and Detective Miller was determined to bring him to justice for his crime. The pressure on Detective Miller and her team grew as the townsfolk of Harmony Creek anxiously awaited news of their beloved church. Justice had to be served. The tension was palpable. With the mounting evidence, Detective Miller made the decision to arrest Bob Jenkins. The arrest took place early in the morning. 2 officers arrived at Bob's house, knocked on the door, and placed him in handcuffs. Bob didn't resist, but his face was a mask of anger and resignation. News of Bob's arrest spread quickly through Harmony Creek, and the town was thrown into turmoil. The reactions were mixed. Some people were shocked and disbelieving. They couldn't imagine that Bob, someone they had known for years, could be capable of such a terrible act. I just can't believe it, said Mrs. Peterson, the widow whose husband Bob had argued with years ago. Bob was always such a nice man. I know he had some disagreements with the church, but I never thought he would do something like this. Others were angry and vengeful. They felt that Bob had betrayed their trust and had destroyed something sacred. They wanted him to be punished severely for his crime. He deserves everything he gets, said Mr. Henderson, the carpenter who had always maintained the church. He took away our church, our community. He should rot in jail. Still others were confused and uncertain. They didn't know what to believe. They remembered Bob as a hard-working and honest man, but they also knew about his history of disputes with the church. They wondered if he was truly guilty or if he was being framed. I don't know what to think, said Sarah, the young girl who had played an angel in the Christmas pageant. I always liked Bob. He was always so nice to me. But if he really did this, then he needs to be held accountable. Pastor Emily tried to calm the townspeople and to encourage them to remain hopeful. She reminded them that Bob was innocent until proven guilty and that they should let the justice system run its course. We need to pray for Bob, she said. We need to pray for healing and for forgiveness. We need to remember that even in the midst of tragedy, we can find strength in our faith and in our community. But despite Pastor Emily's efforts, the town remained divided. The arrest of Bob Jenkins had opened old wounds and had created new divisions. Harmony Creek was no longer the peaceful, close-knit community it once was. The fire had changed everything, and the arrest of Bob Jenkins had only made things worse. The cloud of uncertainty and grief hung heavy over the town, as they waited to see what would happen next. The arrest was only the beginning of a long and difficult process. The town was in shock, anger, and confusion. The community, once united, was now fractured, and the future was uncertain. Would justice be served? The town wondered. The trial of Robert Jenkins began, drawing even more attention to Harmony Creek. The small town felt like it was under a microscope, with reporters and spectators filling the courtroom each day. The atmosphere was tense and somber, as the townspeople waited to hear the evidence that would determine Bob's fate. The prosecution presented a strong case against Bob, relying on several key pieces of evidence. First, they presented the melted cigarette found at the scene of the fire. The lab technician testified about the partial DNA that was extracted from the cigarette and the match that was made to Bob Jenkins. This was the most direct piece of evidence linking Bob to the crime scene. Next, the prosecution called Mrs. Gable to the stand. She testified about seeing Bob's truck near the church on the night of the fire. She described the truck in detail, including the dent in the front fender, and stated that she was fairly certain it was Bob's truck. This testimony placed Bob at the scene of the crime around the time the fire started. Finally, the prosecution presented evidence of Bob's history of disputes with the church. They called Pastor Emily and Mr. Peterson to the stand, who testified about Bob's angry phone calls, his accusations of unfair practices, and his threats of revenge. This evidence established a motive for Bob's alleged crime. The prosecution argued that the combination of the DNA evidence, the witness testimony, and the evidence of Bob's motive was enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of arson. They painted a picture of Bob as a bitter and resentful man who had been driven to commit a terrible act of revenge. The courtroom was silent as the prosecution presented their case. Bob sat at the defense table, his face expressionless. He seemed to be trying to remain calm, but his hands were trembling slightly. He knew that his future was on the line, and the evidence against him was strong. The weight of the evidence presented by the prosecution pressed down on Harmony Creek, adding to the already heavy burden of grief and uncertainty. The trial was a painful reminder of the loss they had suffered and the divisions that had been created within their community. The town held its breath, waiting to see if justice would be served. The evidence was stacked against Bob, but the trial was far from over. The defense would have its chance to present its case, and the jury would ultimately decide Bob's fate. The future of Bob, and the future of Harmony Creek, hung in the balance. The town watched with bated breath. The defense attorney, a sharp woman named Ms. Evans, began her case by attacking the prosecution's evidence. She argued that the DNA evidence was weak and unreliable. She pointed out that it was only a partial DNA profile and that it could have been contaminated. The prosecution wants you to believe that this partial DNA proves that Mr. Jenkins was at the scene of the fire, Ms. Evans said to the jury. But the truth is, this DNA could have gotten there in any number of ways. Someone else could have smoked that cigarette and dropped it there. Or, the cigarette could have been planted there to frame Mr. Jenkins. Ms. Evans also challenged Mrs. Gable's testimony. She pointed out that Mrs. Gable had only seen the truck for a few seconds in the dark and that she couldn't be absolutely certain that it was Bob's truck. She also suggested that Mrs. Gable might have been mistaken or biased against Bob because of his past disputes with the church. Mrs. Gable is a well-meaning woman, but her memory is not perfect, Ms. Evans said. She could have easily mistaken another truck for Mr. Jenkins' truck. And even if it was Mr. Jenkins' truck, that doesn't prove that he started the fire. He could have been driving by for any number of reasons. Finally, Ms. Evans argued that Bob's history of disputes with the church did not prove that he was capable of arson. She said that Bob was a passionate and hard-working man who had simply been frustrated by the church's unfair practices. "Mr. Jenkins is not a criminal," Ms. Evans said. "He's a good man who has been wronged by the church. He may have said some angry things in the past, but he would never do anything to harm the church or the community." Ms. Evans also presented an alibi witness, a neighbor who testified that he had seen Bob at home on the night of the fire. The neighbor admitted that he hadn't seen Bob all night, but he said that he had seen him briefly in the evening and that he seemed to be at home. The defense's strategy was to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. They wanted to convince them that the evidence against Bob was not strong enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They hoped that they could raise enough questions and inconsistencies to persuade the jury to acquit Bob. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Ms. Evans concluded her case. Had she done enough to sway the jury? The fate of Bob Jenkins, and the peace of Harmony Creek, hung in the balance. The defense sought to sow seeds of uncertainty. Had it worked? The town wondered. After closing arguments, the jury filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations. The fate of Bob Jenkins, and the peace of Harmony Creek, now rested in their hands. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional cough or rustle of clothing. The townspeople waited anxiously for any news from the jury room. Hours passed, and still, there was no word. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker with each passing minute. People whispered to each other, speculating about what the jury was discussing. Some were optimistic that Bob would be found guilty, while others feared that the defense had succeeded in creating reasonable doubt. Detective Miller sat quietly, her face betraying nothing. She had done her job, gathering the evidence and presenting it to the court. Now, it was up to the jury to decide whether that evidence was enough to convict Bob Jenkins. Pastor Emily prayed silently, hoping that justice would be served, whatever the outcome. She knew that the trial had been difficult for everyone in Harmony Creek and that the verdict would have a profound impact on the town's future. As the hours dragged on, the suspense became almost unbearable. The townspeople started to gather outside the courthouse, waiting for any sign of a verdict. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, a mixture of hope, fear, and uncertainty. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a court officer emerged from the jury room. He approached the judge and whispered something in his ear. The judge nodded solemnly and announced that the jury had reached a verdict. A gasp swept through the courtroom. Everyone held their breath, waiting to hear the verdict that would determine Bob's fate and the future of Harmony Creek. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The moment of truth had arrived. What would the verdict be? The town held its breath. The silence was deafening. The weight of the town's hopes and fears rested on the shoulders of the 12 jurors. The air crackled with anticipation. The long wait had finally come to an end. The decision was made. The suspense was over. Or was it? The judge called the courtroom to order. The jury filed back into the jury box, their faces unreadable. The clerk asked the foreperson, "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, stood up. "Yes, we have, Your Honor." The clerk asked, "What is your verdict?" The foreperson said, her voice clear and steady, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Jenkins, not guilty." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Some people cried out in shock and disbelief. Others sighed in relief. Bob Jenkins, who had been sitting rigidly at the defense table, slumped back in his chair, his face a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. Detective Miller remained impassive, but inside, she felt a wave of disappointment. She had worked so hard to build a case against Bob, and she was convinced that he was guilty. But the jury had decided that the evidence was not enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Pastor Emily closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. She knew that the verdict would be difficult for many people in Harmony Creek to accept, but she hoped that it would bring some closure to the town. The news of the verdict spread quickly through Harmony Creek, and the town was once again thrown into turmoil. Those who believed in Bob's innocence were overjoyed, while those who believed in his guilt were outraged. The town remained divided, but there was also a sense of resignation. The trial was over, and the jury had spoken. It was time for Harmony Creek to move on, to heal its wounds, and to rebuild its church. Although Bob was found not guilty, the shadow of suspicion would likely follow him for the rest of his days. He was free, but he was also marked. The town knew his history, his resentment, and the evidence that had pointed to him. The verdict, while providing a legal conclusion, did little to ease the pain and confusion in Harmony Creek. The fire had left scars that would take a long time to heal, and the trial had only reopened those wounds. Despite the verdict, the town had to move forward. Harmony Creek had to rebuild. The path to recovery and reconciliation would be long and arduous, but the spirit of Harmony Creek, like the embers of a fire, still glowed within the ashes. Harmony Creek had to move forward. What would happen next? The town wondered. The trial was over, but the story of Harmony Creek was not. Harmony Creek had to rebuild. What would happen next? The town wondered. The trial was over, but the story of Harmony Creek was not. The days following the trial were difficult for Harmony Creek. The town was still divided, and the pain of losing their church was still raw. But slowly, surely, signs of healing began to emerge. Pastor Emily took the lead, organizing community meetings to discuss the future of the church. She emphasized the importance of forgiveness and reconciliation, urging the townspeople to put aside their differences and work together to rebuild. "We may not agree on everything," she said at one meeting, "but we all share a love for this community and a desire to see our church rise again. Let us focus on what unites us, not what divides us." The townspeople responded to Pastor Emily's call. They began to volunteer their time and resources to the rebuilding effort. Mr. Henderson, the carpenter, offered to oversee the construction of the new church. Mrs. Gable organized a fundraising campaign to raise money for the project. And Sarah, the young girl who had played an angel in the Christmas pageant, started a petition to gather support for the rebuilding effort. Even Bob Jenkins, despite the suspicion that still surrounded him, offered to help. He approached Pastor Emily and said that he wanted to use his skills as a contractor to contribute to the rebuilding of the church. Pastor Emily hesitated at first, but then she decided to give him a chance. She believed that everyone deserved a second chance and that Bob's offer was a genuine attempt to make amends. The rebuilding process was long and arduous, but the townspeople persevered. They worked tirelessly, day after day, to clear the debris, lay the foundation, and raise the walls of the new church. As the new church began to take shape, a sense of hope and optimism returned to Harmony Creek. The townspeople realized that they had been through a difficult time, but they had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The new church was not exactly the same as the old church, but it was even better. It was bigger, brighter, and more modern. It was a symbol of the town's resilience and its unwavering faith. On the day of the dedication ceremony, the townspeople gathered outside the new church, their hearts filled with joy and gratitude. Pastor Emily gave a moving sermon.